Okay, good. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Ava Sims from the psychology department, and I'm here with my PlaceLab research group, which consists out of a group of community members and graduate students. And the presentation today will consist first of a film screening, a documentary that we made in my research group. And then we have our panel members, which I'll introduce in a minute, will say something for a couple of minutes. Then we open it up for questions and answers. And then we have another short presentation that we recorded, which is from one of our team members who did a review of practices of restorative juvenile justice from a cross-cultural perspective. So just briefly, let me introduce my fellow PlaceLab members who are here and who will be talking with me and who were instrumental in making the documentary. And I hope that Rick was able to join us again. Richard Bigelow, can you just say hello for just a minute so that we see you on the screen? Because I have so many people on the screen, I'm not quite sure. Let me just.
He's there. I don't know if he has good reception though.
All right. Okay. We'll see. Hopefully he'll be there. Maybe. Yeah. So then let me just start with Christian Nowlin. And Christian, can you say hello so that you come on the big screen for a second?
Hello, everybody. My name is Christian Nowlin. And
okay.
See you. I guess you can see me.
Yeah, and Christian Nowlin is our filmmaker. So we're really privileged to have him here. And he's also a community member from the Beltzhoover neighborhood. The other member is PhD student Lucas Goodwin, who has been with us for a number of times. And Luke, can you say something because they can't see you otherwise?
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Lucas Goodwin, you can call me Luke.
Yeah. And, Luke is also a member of PlaceLab. He's also a member of the Elsinore Bennu think tank. And you probably have heard about Elsinore Bennu before. So we have a lot of intersections in our interest around justice, juvenile justice issues with the think tank. I wondered if, Rick, are you here? Otherwise, I'll introduce you afterwards. Okay. Luke, do you think you could text him and find out if
I think I finally got it.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
There we go. I'm back.
Yes. All right. So that's Rick Bigelow, who's also a team member of ours. And he grew up also like Christian did in the Beltzhoover neighborhood, which you see features kind of prominently in our documentary. Rick is actually somebody who has worked on violence prevention for the larger part of his life, I would say, has worked with youth since his early 20s, and is involved in a number of community organizations in the Beltzhoover neighborhood. And I wanted to say that about Christian as well. Christian is also a community activist and works with the South Hilltop Men's Group, who works with returning citizens. So both of them have a deep history working on violence and justice issues in Pittsburgh neighborhood, since we're talking today about local justice issues. So I don't want to talk too long, but I wanted to situate the documentary for just a few minutes, because it's probably an odd thing that you have psychologists making a documentary. What happened was, together with one of my community partners, Dr. Bay from the Urban Kind Institute in Beltzhoover, he and I had been working on parks issues, nature issues, and in African-American neighborhoods for a while. And in one of the projects that we were engaged in, we encountered violence in the neighborhood. So he asked me if we could do some work on violence in Beltzhoover. So we settled on doing an oral history project and investigating in depth the history of violence in Beltzhoover, beginning in the 1990s with the beginning of the decline of Pittsburgh, unemployment, the crack epidemic, and the formation of gangs. So we did oral histories about that time with different people and the shift into that time and then what happened. And I did that work with my undergraduate students, the seniors in the psychology department. And then in the middle of the project, some of the people we had interviewed who were ex-gang members contacted me and asked if there was any way how we could help one of the people that used to be one of their gang members who had been incarcerated at that time for like 23 years. His name is Keith Hicks. He was a juvenile lifer who was incarcerated without parole for the murder, a drive-by shooting of a boy, Terry Allen, in the Hilltop neighborhoods. So when we were asked, he had been incarcerated for almost a quarter century. And so as psychologists, we had to figure out how are we approaching this out of our discipline. We're not lawyers, we're not in criminal justice. So what can we contribute as psychologists? And so my research group and I thought about this, and one interesting thing, which you will also see in the documentary, is that the Supreme Court decided in 2012 that life without parole is unconstitutional in the United States, and it was also instituted retroactively. So it meant that people like Keith Hicks, who were incarcerated as juvenile lifers without parole, had the chance of having their sentence commuted to a sentence with parole and a shorter sentence. So Keith Hicks would have a hearing. And so we settled on creating a documentary that used the psychological material that the Supreme Court used to argue for why it is unconstitutional to have juvenile lifers or juveniles incarcerated for life. So we reviewed that literature and updated it to some of the current work. So that was like one body of material that we had that we could use to argue in the resentencing hearing that juveniles like Keith Hicks would have to be treated differently and would need and should get a different kind of sentence. The other thing that we did is we used the interviews on the oral history interviews on Beltzhoover and violence. So we had materials, and what you will see in the documentary is we used kind of the psychological literature. We used the oral history background from our interviews, and we used Keith Hicks' story, and we visited Keith. We got his input. He did the same interview that I did, with the other members, just in writing. And so he kind of participated in creating all this. So, maybe I don't even need to say any more. So we created this documentary originally as part of the resentencing hearing. The court did not allow it, but the lawyer used the materials pretty intensely, to craft the proceedings from his end. So I think we're kind of ready to show you the documentary, and then we have a discussion of it later. And it's called Juvenile Justice in Context. Okay, Dee, can you screen it from your side?
Yes, I can. 1 second.
And can we see it when you do that? Can you screen share?
Yeah, I think we should be able to, Ava.
Sorry, just give me 1 second.
Yes.
being slow.
Because it's from the podium there, right? I assume.
I'm just re-pulling it up. Okay, I'm going to screen share now. Are you able to hear it on your end?
Yeah, are you playing it from the podium?
I am.
Good.
Are you able to hear it on Zoom?
Yes. Yes.
Maybe it will load better now.
And can you make it larger?
This is
Yeah, that's the right one.
it's just having loading issues. Perhaps it would make more sense if you screen shared from your end. The streaming services.
Over the last decade, the
Okay.
United States.
Give me a minute. I need to. Okay, hang on a minute. I gotta pull it up just a second. Okay. Hang on a minute. Okay.
Apologize for the technical difficulties, everyone. It happens.
Yeah. 1 minute. I hope this is our last version. So I think so. Okay. Let me see. Okay, give me a second. I need to go back to my Zoom here. Is it okay?
Perfect.
Over the last decade, the United States Supreme Court has ruled that juvenile capital punishment and mandatory life without parole sentences are unconstitutional. The judges cited neuropsychological research about the limitations of adolescent brain development and determined that the unique traits of adolescents' cognitive and emotional development are significant mitigating circumstances when considering the punishment of minors. In the 2016 case, Montgomery versus Louisiana, the Supreme Court ruled that the decision applies retroactively, but left no guidelines for how judges should resentence more than 2,100 people who fall into this category nationally, many of whom have been in prison for decades. Keith Hicks was one of those young people sentenced as an adolescent to life without parole. In 1994, when he was 16 years old, he participated in a gang-related homicide in retaliation for the murder of one of his friends. Now, at 41 years old, he has spent the last 25 years of his life in prison. During his sentencing, the mitigating circumstances of his life as a youth growing up in Beltzhoover, as well as the particular limitations of adolescent developmental neuropsychology, were not considered. This is his story.
I think it is important to get a picture of what the context of adolescents, of children and adolescents growing up in neighborhoods like Beltzhoover was like.
My mom's was a super hard worker as a nurse's aide, and my pops was into construction. My dad could fix, build basically anything, but he was temperamental. And when he gave us beatings sometimes, it was borderline child abuse. Some of it was, but that is how he was raised.
See, Beltzhoover has gone amongst many changes. The Beltzhoover I grew up in my early years, is completely different than what you see on the news and society will tell you. Completely different. This was a neighborhood of manicured lawns. There were homeowners association. Like you would get a fan if your lawn was a manicured when I was little. There were multiple businesses. It was a great place to be. None of my other friends in other neighborhoods, they even knew where it was. Like everyone was like, Beltzhoover, what is that? Where's that? So this was a neighborhood that had privilege. It was working families. Jamil and I, Jamar, our father, we're a part of the last generation in Beltzhoover where we all had dads at home. Like, what do you mean you don't have a dad? Like my mom and dad, even though they're still together now, like as though their parents were still together. All my friends, we had our moms and dads. I was 7 years old when I moved to Beltzhoover. The neighborhood was a beautiful neighborhood. 80% of the households were two-parent homes. Graduation rate was probably in the upper 80s for high school. Up until the time I was, I think, 18, I didn't know of anyone ever being shot or killed. Maybe someone did get shot, but he didn't die.
When the steel mills closed, African Americans were disproportionately hard hit by losing jobs, either becoming unemployed or getting jobs that did not pay the bills. So you had an increase in poverty rate in general in Pittsburgh, but even more so in African American neighborhoods like Beltzhoover.
It was coincident that when that mills, the crack, all that seemed to happen. It was a conflict, all of it at one time. The closing of the mill, the introduction of the crack cocaine, and the introduction of the gangs. All seemed to coincide between 88 and 93, which is when most of the violence occurred.
We lived in a really nice house, dogs, fence, all that. But my pops became an alcoholic, then a crackhead. My mom ain't know he was smoking crack for a while, and he would steal money from her and blame us and punish us for it on top of it. But me and my brother knew he was on drugs because by then Beltzhoover became one of the city's biggest open drug markets. And he would buy crack off of our friends, 12, 13, 14 years old. And we would get made fun of for it. But the crazy part is all my friends had one or both parents on crack, with the exception of a few. So we all felt each other's pain, even though sometimes we contributed to it.
But at that point in time, I didn't want anybody to know my dad was on drugs, specifically crack, because that's, kids' crib and everything else. But that was going to be something that I don't know how I was going to respond, because it was the truth. I was living it. It was a nightmare.
So this upwardly mobile neighborhood that used to have predominantly two-parent households experienced the influx of the crack epidemic to a very powerful degree.
All that hit at the same time, and Keith walked right into it. And his lifestyle, his home style made him a perfect candidate. Because it was crazy. If his dad would have stayed the way he was, As intelligent as Keith is, there's no telling what he do.
I started looking up to the dudes on the corner. Although the guys I hung with all were not drug dealers, we kind of formed a bond out of pain. And that was the beginning of a gang. But at the time, we ain't called ourselves a gang. We just had each other's back. If you were hungry, we fed each other. Those of us who did sell drugs provided.
This is a period of heightened sensations that not always, but can lead to risk-taking behavior. The adolescent brain has to be more reactive that might be informing culpability during a crime that is done during the adolescent period. So they were on adolescence. Adolescence is fleeting. We don't know who that individual is going to be once they become an adult. And they are more prone to their environmental circumstances, but also may be more amenable to rehabilitation.
So we do have a lot of data that shows that over time, young people do change. That what they do, what marks them as an adolescent, isn't necessarily who they're going to become when they're older. And there are many examples, and again, a lot of evidence that points to this capacity of young people.
Can I look at a brain and see this brain is a criminal brain? Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. The adolescent brain may be more amenable to rehabilitation than that of an adult.
Child and adolescent development always happens within a context. And the context of children like Keith, who grew up in African-American neighborhoods in the 1980s and the 1990s, gives us a picture of how difficult it was for children to navigate their way into growing up into adulthood.
In thinking about the community context is exposure to violence. So there's an increasing amount of evidence that in just being exposed to violence can have negative effects on young people and young people's behavior. So when we see, particularly in situations where you have communities with very high rates of violence in that community, we're learning now that that can really affect and shape a young person's outcomes and a young person's actions, right? How do they respond in that context?
I had no peace at school, always getting jumped. I hardly ever stayed at home anymore because there were bloods that wanted to kill me. So I stayed over friends' houses in Beltzhoover, so it reinforced this extended family thing. I'm not alone. All of us had hard, crazy lives, so we related to each other. Even when we couldn't tell our parents what was wrong or a school counselor, we could feel each other's pain without all the words. Feel me?
When I wasn't in the gang, I still had to fight the gang fights. So by the time I got to Carrick High School, which people from St. Clair, Beltzhoover, rivals were in there, I didn't have trouble in the high school as much as I did getting off the bus in the afternoon. I would get off the bus and our bus stop was in Mount Oliver, which is here. And that puts Carrick up here. So, you still had to catch the bus to Beltzhoover. And when I tell you the stores would empty out with guys from St. Clair, 4, 5, 6 years older than me. And you had to fight almost every day. So it was almost like I either rolled with my cousins in the crew because I'm fighting those battles anyway, or, continue to fight standing on my own.
You couldn't go to school with just your books, right? You had to have your books, your book bag, and a gun.
Many of the young men, particularly if they came from homes that did not function very well anymore, came together and found friendship and a sense of belonging, sense of identity among the other men. Because the older generation, the older men who used to be the mentors, were either now drug dealers or they were parents, fathers, older men who have become addicted to drugs and then have become incarcerated.
I've done some research, and age is related to misconducts. So juveniles don't do time well, and it relates to a lot of those issues that we talk about in terms of development, in terms of the institutional structure, but they don't do time well. So the question being, it's very clear that a lot of them are going to get misconduct, but then what's the pattern of behavior as they're maturing? Do we see the misconduct, the behavior that got them misconducts or prison infractions? Do we see that decline? Do we see that decrease?
I wrote an apology letter and sent it to Harrisburg. I don't know if his family requested it. Part of me wants to beg them for forgiveness so bad. I would want them to know that I know I had no right to take their son's life. He could have been anything, and I took that away. I will want them to know that I am no longer the same dude I was when I came to jail.
If somebody has a long period, 15 years, 10 years, 20 years of no prison misconducts, no infractions, that's a very positive sign. It's a sign that, that one, I do think that maturity is taking hold, but it's also, when you look at the literature and when you look at criminal offending, a lot of times it's not, the offense that somebody commits isn't predictive necessarily of whether they're going to keep. It's the pattern of behavior, right? So are they what we refer to the criminal or the career criminal, as opposed to just, an adolescent limited? So when we're looking at young people, we're looking at those patterns. And I think, prison behavior, we can look at it in the same way, in that, if they, as they're adapting to the institution, commit some infractions or behave in certain ways, and then that stops and it goes in a different direction. Again, to me, in my take on the literature and my take on my own work, this is a positive sign in terms of their ability to adapt to the outside world.
I have a very strong support system. My big brother made it. He went to junior ROTC, made it, became a teacher. Takes care of his family like a real man. His wife, 2 kids, and my mom live with him.
So how has Keith changed over the past 24 years? Number one, he's grown. But when I say he's grown, it's just that he's grown. As I've grown, as I'm watching this or growing now, time has changed, he's matured. He set goals for himself. Ultimately, one of them will be to be free. That's out of his hands, but he's preparing himself that if that ever does come about, he will be ready.
Another thing that I think we can point to with regard of to thinking about whether somebody's going to be successful is, what did they do while they're in prison? What did they do for themselves in terms of bettering themselves, gaining skills, developing, and what are they doing for others as well? So I've talked to a lot of prison officials who've talked about how juvenile lifers can be a stabilizing influence in their institutions, in their settings, that they can play a positive role for younger inmates in particular in the prison setting. So looking at how they've spent their time, how did they do their time?
I feel like I have a gift for reaching younger dudes. And when I feel the opportunity presents itself, I try to save lives. I try to plant those seeds of life.
Adolescence is temporary. And I often will look around and go, we were all adolescents once, actually very brief. And we don't know who that person's going to be.
Over the last 2 decades, Keith has gone from being an incarcerated, misguided teenager to a thriving, mature adult whom many others look up to and respect. He has completed a wide range of trainings, certificates, and programs, many of which are only available to inmates with good standing, and others require recommendations from prison authorities. He has completed his HVAC and carpentry certifications, completed a peer counseling certification, and participated in a therapy dog training program. Recently, he's taken Spanish and business classes. As a peer counselor, Keith is often approached on the block or in the yard by inmates who struggle emotionally or face dilemmas such as whether to avenge violence done to them. 2 late evenings every week, Keith is asked to do a suicide watch. He walks the hallways of the solitary housing unit, as well as death row and the gang unit, to offer support and counsel to inmates who have no one else to talk to. Keith also runs a group called Double Trouble, which is part of a dual diagnosis program for men who struggle with both substance abuse and mental illness. Keith is engaged nearly all day, every day, in making a difference for himself and in the lives of others.
Song of a life. Walk on. Walk on through the wind. Walk on. Walk and walk on. Walk on. Walk on through the rain. Walk on.
Okay. All right. So I thought the way we were going to proceed is I wanted to invite our panel members, which is Christian, Rick, and Luke, maybe to reply and respond. And if any of you who have joined us a little later, or seen only parts of it, or you in the audience, if you have any questions, put them into the chat. And Luke will check those later, and Dee will collect it, I think, from the audience. So, but I thought maybe we should hear first from Christian Nowlin, who's our filmmaker. Christian, do you just want to say something?
Yeah, so, working on the project, I became involved, I think, when you guys had already started gathering information. And once business partner Jamar told me about the project, I was like, oh yeah, of course, I'd pretty much do anything for Keith, because Keith was a young man that I seen, and he was my brother's age, and I seen the type of man that he was and how influential he was, and how he was just so talented. He just had a natural attraction to him, as far as just like there was something about him that just glowed. And so, I loved Keith, as a young man, he was special. And so I know about the event. I know about what happened, and not justifying anything that happened is very tragic what happened. But Keith was a child, and he was a child that, experienced the loss of his friend, a loved one, someone that he grew up with, and, one of his best friends, and emotionally a wreck as a child, in kind of like a powder keg environment where, the normal thought processes weren't being exhibited in our community at that time. I mean, because our community had went through so many different stages from, you know, being one of the most beautiful places to grow up in to a community that was overrun by drugs and guns. And, you know, none of the people in my community had any boats or any planes to fly drugs into our community. So we don't make any guns. We don't have any access to most of the things that come into our community. So these things were placed into our community and they filled a hole that was in the community at that time, which was, that hole was created by, you know, like Dr. Ava said in the documentary, the steel mills closing down. So a lot of people losing their jobs created a hole, and it was filled with a lot of bad things. And so Keith became a product of years of, you know, the community just going down. And he had no clue of, you know, well, he had a little clue of how the community once was, because at one point in time, his family was intact. And once things spiraled out of control, it was almost as if the children ran the community. So at one point in time in our community, a lot of the older people became addicted to drugs, crack cocaine specifically. And then the kids were like calling the shots. And as we know, you know, a child left to himself, his or herself, you know, they're pretty much going to go in directions that are not the best routes to take. And so, and that's what happened to Keith. And working on this project was a blessing for me, for one, to be able to help my friend, a young man that, you know, I wish the road could have went in a different direction, but also it helped me to understand things that were going on in that time, because I myself was a product of environment. So I myself, you know, went through the stages that most people haven't. You know, I seen it when it was beautiful. I seen it when there was mothers and fathers in the home. I seen it when there was no drugs in the community. I seen it where people smiled and the sun was shining, and, you know, it was a beautiful place to be. And then I seen the other side as well. And, you know, a lot of things happened during that time to where, you know, good children turned into, you know, things that they had no clue place. They basically turned into, you know, adults that were tainted and by the environment. And I myself was a part of that. And I myself became tainted, and I did many things. Many people in the community did many things that I'm sure, you know, if they had a chance to go back in time, they wouldn't. And working on this project allowed me to, you know, work with doctors who were studying, you know, these different things that were going on in the community, you know, the brain, as far as, you know, Dr. Luna working with children on how the brain functions. And, you know, that allowed me to, you know, gain healing for the things that I did as a child that I really was still holding myself accountable for. And being that these are children, I think that the justice system itself, you know, has failed children. It has failed in how it handles children, especially Black children. You know, you see stories today where, you know, a Black child does something and he's the greatest villain since the Joker in Batman, you know, and then a white child will shoot up a school or something and, you know, oh, well, he was just misunderstood. And so, you know, I believe that the justice system isn't blind. And I think it does see color. And it's a sad thing. And I think that, you know, we have a long way to go in this country, if the country makes it to where things can be, all of the wrongs can be righted. Because like I said, you know, our community was a beautiful place. And then it's like somebody hit a switch and said, okay, we're going to turn this off. And then everything just was destroyed. And, you know, so it was a blessing for me to work on this project, to work with the people on the project, to be able to learn and understand and go back in time and heal from different things that were going on in my community. And, you know, and I'm just waiting for, well, I'm not even waiting. I'm not waiting for things to turn around. I'm actually very active in helping things turn around. So now in my adult life, that's what I focus on. I focus on righting the wrongs, trying to help build a better future for the children growing up in my community.
Thank you so much, Christian. And then maybe Rick, we take you next, because I think you really probably connect with what Christian said.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, and more ways than one, obviously. Having grown up literally under Chris, him being a big brother to me, growing up 2 doors up on Vincent Street from him and his wonderful family. And it just takes me back every time I see the documentary that he put together and that we all participated in. It hits me. You know, I'll put it like this: you guys, to you all, it's just a documentary. To many of you all, and nothing. You know, I don't mean anything offensive by saying that. It's just like me watching a movie on Netflix or a documentary on air. But when it's you directly involved, it hits you completely different. So these were not only the experiences that Keith had; these are my friends and family, and myself having to star in these what I call movies, drama movies that, as Chris described, you know, the youth begin to run things, but I take it even a step further. These were movies that none of us wanted to participate in. Like Keith didn't want to become a Beltzhoover gang member, having to do de facto security in the you know, the form of committing violence to scare another neighborhood from committing violence on the youth down in Beltzhoover, and back and forth and vice versa for the children of St. Clair. So these became, when you think about it, these were like daily Mission Impossible missions. I'll take a guy like myself who, like Christian, ended up having to do things, uh, starting from elementary, going to Great Beltzhoover Elementary School like Chris did, very high academic standards. I was a scholar. I was in the gifted program from 2nd grade on until I dropped out my junior year in high school because I wanted to be too cool. But the things that led to that, I didn't want. And the things that I ended up having to do in the street, I didn't want to do. So Chris looks at it like, you know, he started participating in certain negative activities. No, brother, you were forced into a movie, into a survival mode that you didn't want to do, knowing the man that you were. When I was growing up, you didn't want to do some of the things that you ended up having to do. That wasn't something that we grew up ascribing to do. So watching this just hits me on so many levels, and knowing that Keith's story is like so many other young people. I'll give a quick little layer to Keith's story. About 2 years before Keith's incident, I was at Carrick High School, and a guy that I grew up with, I'll leave his name out. And, you know, we played football together in youth leagues. And make a long story short, he had gotten into a bad fight down at not at Station Square, at Point Park at, I forgot the summer celebration. Anyway, he got into a fight, and one of the guys he got into a fight with ended up dying. So we all just knew, you know, his life was going to be twisted and over. But to piggyback off what Chris says, our court systems do see color, because this young man who initially was facing manslaughter, and none of us wanted to see him locked up, his life changed, and he was given a chance that people like Keith never get. And what I mean by that is he's now a parole officer who's been in the Beltzhoover and has taken people to jail. So the chance that he was given as an 18-year-old who participated in that often doesn't come the way of people who look like Christian and myself is with, he's saying. And I say that not to say the typical, oh, race thing. I say, let's look at our court systems, because anytime I see a young African-American or any age African-American get sentenced or he's brought up before jury, I've never seen an all-Black jury. And I say, has that ever happened? And has any white person in this country ever been tried by an all-Black jury? And I'm willing to say probably not. Probably not. So just on its surface of those type of simple questions that many of us probably never asked ourselves, we have a problem. So when I see this juvenile justice film, it hits me on so many different levels and layers, and I could go, different places. But I wanted to give Brother Luke a chance to give his take on it. He's one of our brothers who participated in it as well.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, thanks, Rick and Christian, for sharing those thoughts. I'm also hit on a lot of levels by the documentary, which I had the good fortune of joining the team in 2017 when I first started at Duquesne. And, to Rick's point, I'm coming at the documentary from a different lived experience than Christian and Rick. It is the Keith's experience is not something that I can relate to in the same way that they can. And yet the creation of the documentary, and even every time I view it, it has a profound impact on me. And just to kind of flesh that out a little, my work as a psychologist has really become about examining the intersection of psychology and the law. And my entree to that work and to that interest was really working on this story itself about Keith Hicks. There's a lot to that. There's a lot of reasons that I think I'm really compelled by and even obligated by doing this work for social justice. Part of it was my experience working with Christian and Rick, getting to know people from different walks of life who, even though we didn't grow up the same way, even though, we have different backgrounds, the camaraderie and the collaboration that we kind of found through working on this project has been just hugely impactful on me and has opened me to looking at the world in a different way. Currently, I'm writing my dissertation on the lived experience of African-American men in racialized encounters with the police. So also to Christian and Rick's points, I do think the criminal justice system is not impartial. I think it does need to be re-examined. But my dissertation, which is really going to be kind of, a huge part of my career as a psychologist, is directly taken from this work on this documentary. So even though I have a different background and history and identity coming into the creation of the film, it has done a lot of work on me personally and professionally. And I really consider myself privileged to have been a part of it and to have met Christian and Rick and to consider them my friends, which is not the research, but I'm really interested in how the making of the documentary or making a documentary like this is a part of the research. All of the interpersonal relations and all of the ethics involved that go on behind the scenes are really instrumental to the documentary that we showed you today. And that's something that we should probably think about some more and write a paper on. But there is kind of this intercultural, interracial, if I'm being honest, bridge that I think is built in doing research like this. So there's that piece. One other thing I'll share, and then we do have a few questions in the chat, is as a psychologist, Ava and I often talk about what's psychological about this film. How can a psychologist contribute to social justice and to legal work? And one thing that jumps out at me, and I think this also speaks to what Christian and Rick have both alluded to, is because both Christian and Rick talked about good people, good kids, all of a sudden found themselves doing things, and the entire community kind of participating in various ways for reasons that were not clear. How did we get to this point? How did Beltzhoover go from this kind of castle on the hill to what it became during the 80s and 90s? And as a psychologist, I think one thing that's really fascinating about the documentary is how it really exposes that we all grow up in a world. We all grow up in a world and are affected by that world. And by world, I mean we all come up in certain social conditions. There's social and political and cultural conditions that fundamentally shape who we are and the decisions we make and the options we have available to us and the behaviors we engage in, and even something like the thoughts we have, the feelings we have. So I think that this documentary for me really highlighted how, none of us come from a vacuum, and any one of us could be Keith had we come from the same neighborhood that he came from. And that for me is an incredibly profound point, and it's something that I'm still trying to kind of work out in my own mind and on paper with my dissertation. Where does society end and the individual begin? How much of each of us is just a product of our environment, and how much of us are more than that? And I don't know that there are ever going to be any, definitive answers to this question, but I think it's incredibly important that we engage with this question. And I think we're beginning to see on a national scale, greater recognition that we are social creatures and that we really are, impacted by social forces, and economic forces and political forces. So that's one way that I see this documentary as being very psychological, is kind of trying to tease out where does the individual and the psychological participate with the social? How do the two interact to determine behavior?
Yeah, thank you, Luke. Luke, can I kind of pick up something and ask you a question about one of your points? And I wanted to think that a little further. Because when you were talking about, the recognition of the social context, and that's why we call the documentary Juvenile Justice in Context, and the larger context of somebody's life. That seems to me in complete contradiction with how the legal system operates, because you're always an individual before the law. And one of the things we try to do in this video, because it's was supposed to be a mitigation video, our thought was we show the context of adolescent life. We show the limitations of adolescent psychology in terms of making good choices, in terms of being susceptible to peer pressure, in terms of the influence of the background of violence and poverty in the neighborhood, the loss of mentors and the older generation. All these are factors, psychological factors, that adolescents are particularly susceptible to. So we wanted to kind of show that, because we had the sense that before the law, Keith was always, especially tried as an adult, he was seen as an individual adult and culpable completely for that, and that's how he was sentenced. So I just kind of wonder if any of you want to respond to that.
Well, when you say he's tried as an adult,
yeah,
that immediately implies that when these cases happen, there's a removal of empathy, and he's no longer seen as, forget a human, he's not seen as a child now. So when you hear the words tried as an adult, instantly there's a removal of empathy and hope. And that's what has often happened in the community. So when you say it like that, I look at it almost like, in the perfect world, we should be like a human body. And what I mean is, okay, being an ex-athlete, if I hurt my elbow, the rest of my body doesn't cut my elbow off. It sends resources to it in the form of, blood flow and whatever else it does to try to heal it, while acknowledging that it's hurting via pain, swelling, and whatnot, to tell me, okay, I may need to go to a hospital or whatnot. But many of us in our communities often feel the opposite. When, something bad happens or we do something wrong, it's like cut all of them off. And, an example would be things like the 94 crime bill, which were aimed at, okay, let's be hard on violence and crack and blah, 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 and ended up doing more damage to said people in said communities than you could ever, so-called say it intended to do. So, that which brings into question the intent of those things. And these often come when you begin to remove empathy, and you don't see, we don't want sympathy, but empathy, which people like Luke has. This is why his dissertation is what it is and the way it is, because he moves with empathy, yourself and many others. All of us on here having this discussion, there's a certain empathy that you have for someone else.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to, the importance of, having a mentor. And there's no bigger mentor than your father. And, I just want to ask the audience, just imagine growing up without your father. Some of you might be going through that. And now you don't have your father, right? Now just imagine, being bombarded by music by male figures who talk about selling drugs and killing people, 24 hours a day. You're listening to, this hyper masculinity, which is telling you to kill somebody if they look at you wrong, sell drugs to make money, and then add in videos and add in all type of gang type of activity from the males who are your peers, and you're a child. And it's going to be hard to, overlook all of these, voices. And when you don't have a male figure in your life, even girls need males. Men are so important, and fathers are so important in the lives of women as well, because in our community, literally the women were, under the spell as well. And so, you had all these influences telling children to kill, telling children to be involved in gangs, telling children to do drugs, telling children to do all kind of things that, nobody's parents would tell them to do. And this is promoted by a media machine, which is, glorifying everything you see on television today. And you have children who don't have the proper guidance in place because maybe their father's gone, maybe their mother's on drugs. And so they're growing up in a reality that's not real. And then they're being held accountable for this unreal education when they do something that, the law, deems is illegal. And so you have, thought processes of illegal activity that are being promoted and making millions and billions of dollars that are affecting children on a day in and day out basis. And that's legal. But then when the children follow it's like Pied Piper when leading the children out of the city, out of the nest of their parents, you know, and then once they go down the road with Pied Piper, now they're, you know, having the book thrown at them. And, you know, we're dealing with serious crises in our community. I mean, right now we have, you know, a heroin epidemic and you know, just, you know, fentanyl. They have a new fentanyl that's hitting the streets now that's literally killing people in less than 24 hours. And these drugs are being taken by children, you know, because it's, you know, they heard their favorite rapper say, you know, pop a pill or, you know, or sip some lean or, you know what I mean? And they're kids. These are kids. And I know speaking from myself, I didn't start growing up till I was like 30 years old. That's when I start, you know, listening to, you know, other mentors, and I read the Bible, you know, so literally, you know, you have grown men who are out here still sagging. They're walking down the street, they're 40, 45 years old, still sagging. Most of the entertainers on that you listen to on radio are children, and you have grown men listening to children, reciting lines that children are saying. So it's, you know, everything is backwards, you know, not everything, but there's many backward ways of thought, you know, in the community. And, you know, not having those strong mentors in place, or, you know, them fathers in place, or, you know, strong mothers in place is very detrimental to the healthy growth of any child or any community.
Okay.
I think we have to, you know, ask ourselves why. And I'll keep this short, Ava, because if we're going to show the other presentation, we should do it soon. But we have to ask ourselves why are conditions the way that they are in Beltzhoover, in the United States, in every community. And to kind of try to tie in Ava's question with what Rick said about used in his example about the elbow, you know, I do think that the judicial system does take a kind of, I think Michelle Alexander and the new Jim Crow refers to it as like the politics of responsibility. So, you know, each of us is kind of an individual responsible for our own actions. And our backgrounds are brought into court cases to an extent, but it's usually after the individual has been sentenced. It's about kind of determining the severity of the charge. Is when it's called, you bring in like character witnesses, or you talk about kind of, well, this person had a really hard life and they were abused and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe they should get a more lenient sentence. But to loop it to Rick's point, I think if we did take a more social responsibility lens, then there would be more, we wouldn't just cut the elbow off, you know, we wouldn't just kind of ostracize the other or throw the book at, you know, the criminal. You know, there might be a more kind of sympathetic, if not empathetic approach to doing justice. But it's about really kind of shifting our ethics. And ultimately, and we were talking about this yesterday in one of our meetings, ultimately, I think it's about like a psychological transformation. And I don't know if that begins with policy on a policy level, or if that begins with social projects and activism, or if that begins just with you and I and everyone on this call. But again, and this is what the documentary speaks to, is how does the social interact with the individual? You know, where does the change take place? How did they interact? Ava, do we want to just keep discussing, or should we show the presentation that we have?
Well, how about we show the presentation and then we take questions from the audience? Does that sound all right?
There were some questions in the chat I was trying to read as well. So.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Oh, you have it? Okay. All right. So I don't need to do that.
Hey everyone, my name is Jonathan Rowe. I'm a new member of Dr. Ava Sims' PlaceLab, and a few weeks ago I did a small research project trying to answer the question of how do other cultures practice a restorative juvenile justice model as opposed to the more retributive style that we have in the West, which is focused on punishment rather than on rehabilitation, restoration of the community, and the righting of wrongs. And the examples that I'll provide here are far from comprehensive, but they are some particularly great examples that can provoke some discussion and spur on our imagination for how restorative juvenile justice could look in the United States. And these aren't things that I would recommend that we start doing overnight, but again, some really powerful things that we can learn from. So we'll jump right into it. My name is Jonathan Rowe. I'm a new member of Dr. Ava Sims' PlaceLab. And of course, South Africa has a long history of injustice stemming from colonial times to the apartheid government. And juvenile justice was one of the many things that were being called for reform around the time of apartheid government. Youth were often taken away without any due process, without being read their rights, with being separated from their family, and potentially being held indefinitely. And one of the committees that was pushing for these reforms had this great quote that I wanted to pull out that I think sums up pretty much exactly what restorative juvenile justice is. And I'll read it now. The approach to young people in trouble with the law should focus on restoring societal harmony and putting wrongs right rather than on punishment. I think that sums up exactly what we're looking for. Another concept I want to bring forward is the concept of Ubuntu. And when we say restorative justice, we often focus on the juvenile
What happened?
attitudes towards justice. The system, but we can just as easily focus on the attitudes towards justice that individuals in a community share. And Ubuntu focuses on an individual, it focuses on a person. When we want to give high praise to someone, we say, you Ubuntu, hey, he or she has Ubuntu. And these qualities that Desmond Tutu lists here, generosity, hospitality, friendliness, care, and compassion, these are many of the qualities we would want to associate with restorative justice. And this could provoke our imagination for how we as a culture might begin to elevate these qualities, consider them something that's aspirational, rather than something that's self-sacrificing, something that's actually, that carries some prestige rather than something that is considered to be altruistic necessarily. It's something that the culture could elevate. And this is considered to be, again, a win for everyone. Even oppressors are intertwined in their own oppression by this model. Another culture that I want to point to that doesn't quite focus on the level of the justice system yet is Maori culture. And the concept of wakapapa is a key concept in Maori culture that goes beyond the concept of justice and really incorporates everything in the chain of being, essentially. Things in nature are considered to have wakapapa, and humans are just one part of that chain of being. And the individual begins with, of course, their immediate family, but also is situated within their extended family, meaning aunts, uncles, cousins, the sub-tribe, and then the tribe above that. And in some cases can be traced all the way back to the original canoe that one's ancestors came to the island on. Now, of course, we don't have anything like this in the United States, but it shows how powerful this can be, situating a person within a community. Along with the sense of sacredness that comes along with this, the word in English taboo actually comes from Maori culture, the word, which doesn't mean what's forbidden necessarily, but it does mean what's holy and sacred. And if something's holy and sacred, that's going to determine what you're prohibited from doing in response to that. And so in Maori culture, the justice system is considered to be a last resort. The community and the family take prime responsibility for dealing with their own young people. In Latin America, Chile has a similar history of oppression and injustice that South Africa experienced under the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. And one of the reconciliation committee, or the reconciliation committee that came about after that that concluded was essentially tasked with the question of how do we live together again? How do communities that have been torn apart by years of oppression come to cooperate and live together again? And that's where this Chilean term reconvivencia comes from, literally meaning to live together again. And there's a lot of literature around this that could be brought in if we wanted to learn more from that. Another model I wanted to bring forward was that of APAC. And this is Portuguese, but it translates to English, Association for the Protection and Assistance of Convicts. And this, I thought, really spurred my imagination for how, once people are in the justice system, it can look different for them. In the 1960s and 70s, many of the state-run prisons were essentially abandoned, with as few as 5 guards overseeing hundreds of inmates or more. And while we would never want these kinds of conditions to emerge, when they did happen, something really extraordinary came about, which is that the inmates began cooperating with the state officials. Some of the inmates had responsibilities as high as holding the keys. Some of them ran the services like the cafeteria, and others ran other various groups. Now, while we have something like this in the United States, prisoners often are allowed to run peer support groups or therapy groups or skills acquisition groups. We could lean into those ideas a lot more, seeing how to what an extreme extent it's been done in APAC. And there's dozens, if not hundreds, of prison systems in Brazil operating on this model. And this figure here of recidivism rates being 15%, just to put that in context, in the United States, the average recidivism rate is about 50%. So in other words, you have about a 50-50 chance once you have entered the justice system to re-enter it again at some point. And if you project that into a juvenile's life, those odds aren't good. So we want to look at something like this to see, obviously we wouldn't start doing this overnight, but if we could see what we could learn from something like this, we could really benefit. So what can we bring to the United States? Well, there are some best practices that are being done around the world and in the United States that come from elsewhere. And I wanted to highlight just a few of those here. And each of these focus on a different level of justice. One is going to be on the individual and their family. The next is going to be on the individuals that are already in the justice system, how they can be treated in a more humane way and follow a restorative model. And the last is going to be on justice more broadly, on how groups can achieve some kind of understanding with each other when there have been many years of conflict. So the first I want to bring forward are family group conferences. These originated in New Zealand, and when they were implemented, youth incarceration went down as much as 63%. So pretty powerful stuff to divert youth from the incarceration system. And what these groups are is they consist of the youth in question who's being accused of a crime, the youth's family, however that is interpreted by the youth, the victim, and the victim's supporters and family, if needed, a police officer, and really any other official or mentor figure that wants to be involved. And these groups come to a decision on what should be done, whether that should be prosecution and going into the justice system as they may have done in the old ways, or anything in between, from community service to financial compensation to a simple apology. You know, the group, including the victim, is going to decide what's appropriate. And this is particularly unique from our system, which doesn't really involve the victim at all. The individual who's accused of the crime is just taken and placed before the state, not with their community, not with their family, but on their own. And the victims aren't even really consulted in the whole process, which is something I thought was really remarkable that we take for granted in our culture. In New Zealand, the courts have a pretty high rate of agreement with these groups, showing that there's a really good relationship between family group conferences and the courts. And this is a really easy sell because it keeps youth out of the system, which a lot of parties could be interested in. The next example I'll bring forward is Sycamore Tree. And there are a lot of examples like Sycamore Tree, but this is simply one of the biggest ones that I wanted to bring forward. And this is for folks that are already in the incarceration system. This particular program has been done all over the world, and it is in fact being done in the United States. This is a 6-session program which involves volunteers from the community coming into the prisons to speak with inmates who have volunteered for the program. The volunteers from the community have been victims of crime that the inmates have been accused of. Now, granted, these are not connected in any way. These aren't the victims of the current inmates, but they're victims of similar crimes. And they will come in and share their stories, and at the end, the inmates will make some kind of symbolic act of restitution, whether it's a poem, a craft, an apology, something along those lines. And this is really powerful, both for the inmate and for the community volunteer that comes in. And again, there are other programs like this. I'll have a list of references at the end, but even though this is being done, it's something we could really lean into more and apply specifically to a juvenile context. And the last example I'll bring forward is dispute systems design. This came out of strikes in the coal industry in the 1980s, and it was used in another study, this 2014 study I've listed here, in which Native Alaskan juveniles were being torn essentially between the tribal courts of Native Alaska, Native Alaskan groups, and the state courts. In Alaska, in the tribal communities, the tribal courts generally have jurisdiction over the youth, but the states have jurisdiction over criminal proceedings, creating an inherent tension between them. And this is after a long history of cultural erasure and power struggle between the Native Alaskan tribes and the state government. So this model was used to try to achieve some kind of interest between them. This model has a lot of steps to it, but essentially it boils down to three basic approaches to resolving conflict. The least desirable is power, in which one group simply asserts their power over the other. The next is rights, which we often associate positively, but in reality, conflicts are better resolved when there's mutual interest. That's going to be the ideal in a dispute systems design. And this is outlined in some of these sources we see here. I believe the Jarrett and Hislop study was dispute systems design. And again, none of these things are comprehensive. None of these things are going to be immediate overnight fixes, but I hope this provides some discussion and some conversation for how we could reimagine a juvenile justice system in the United States. Thank you very much.
All right, everybody. We would like to just maybe open it up for some questions. And Dee, I wondered if there are any questions from the live audience. Maybe we begin there.
Yes, there are. And so I put them in the chat so that everyone can see them. I've been writing them as some of them have been coming in. Well, our first question, in the beginning, Dr. Sims said that the court did not accept the documentary, but that the lawyers used the documentary to shape the defense for Keith. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened there and what avenues Keith might have going forward?
Yeah. Okay, what happened was that the assistant district attorney who was prosecuting the case complained that she was not allowed to interview the expert witnesses, which was me and Dr. Luna and Dr. Shook. And so, she very vehemently argued against the inclusion of the documentary, and so the judge disallowed it. But we had worked very closely with Keith's lawyer, so all the materials we had gathered, and the kind of like the plot of how to argue this case, he actually kind of followed that really closely in terms of like the witness testimony that he got and the case that he made. So it was almost like a parallel show to the film that we had created. So that's kind of what happened with it. And so the documentary, it really, it was never shown at the court, but it has been really embraced by a number of different groups who are advocacy groups for juvenile lifers. And kind of Luke mentioned it earlier, but one of the phrases that we hear is like, we're all Keith, kind of. Then it seems to have become the rallying cry for a lot of people who see it and can identify with Keith's story. Okay, was there anything else?
Yes, there's two more questions minutes here, but I think that Dr. McMillan's question is really fantastic. If you guys would like to skip to that one and circle back.
Yeah, Luke, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, that's good. So Dr. McMillan says, I think the film powerfully awakens the sociological imagination, especially its historical and economic factors. Do you think this exposes the myths of individualism and equality in American culture? I mean, I think I kind of spoke or tried to speak to that a little bit earlier. Maybe I'll just add that, there is this myth in this country of quote unquote rugged individualism, and in the West, the Western world in general, we are known to be a more individualistic culture. And that means a lot of different things and expresses itself in a lot of different ways. And one of those ways is in the criminal justice system. And as I also said earlier, I think that in my mind, part of this current moment in time where I feel like we're seeing shifting discourses in this country, and a lot of it has to do with social justice. I think we're beginning, many of us are beginning to take into account that rugged individualism only goes so far. And, if you look at the presentation that we just saw, what is common amongst every different culture's approach to restorative juvenile justice? It's community. Mm-hmm. Community is the key component in every approach to restorative juvenile justice that we just learned about. And so, I'm hopeful that this shifting moment, this tide that we're on, will lead to a more community-based approach, and not just, the Beltzhoover community on its own. I mean, every community has its kind of own personality and own membership and functions, but I would like to see a kind of more comprehensive, inclusive community on a larger scale. All of Pittsburgh, all of Western PA, all of the United States. So, I mean, hopefully that's where we're headed. Go ahead, Ava.
Yeah, no, I just wonder if Rick or Christian would like to respond to that, if to this issue of community and maybe community justice. If
Yeah,
not,
our community, it was based on, like a collective, and individualism kind of killed our community, where people started, thinking about themselves, and it destroyed the fabric that was intact when our community was at its best, which is, it was the neighborhood. Like, Rick's mother was my mother. My mother was Rick's mother. You know what I mean? And that's how we moved and behaved. We couldn't do certain things because we had mothers all the way down the block, so we couldn't do certain things. But soon as, that detachment happened, it seemed like, things began to get worse and worse. And as far as equality goes, there is no equality in this country. There's not, it doesn't exist. But, I'll let Rick speak to it if he wants to.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off what you all are saying and what Luke was saying about communities. One of the things that I promote heavily is, like Chris was saying, the role of the father. And I go back to that, meaning I promote families, meaning I try to, I mentor some young women right now and young men on, not having children out of wedlock, because you can't have communities unless you have families. Like Chris said, his mom was my mom because their family lived in the house 2 doors down. My family lived 2 doors up. So I'm heavy into promoting families. Again, our issues, like Chris said, the individualism has destroyed that. I can't speak for other communities, but I can speak for the African American community in America prior to 1965, we were married at an over 80% rate. And I'll go on record saying the things that they faced back in the 50s and before were a lot tougher than the societal things that we or the things that are inflicted on us on a daily basis now. So we have to get back, and that's every community, to promoting families again. Um, and when you have a promotion of families, you begin to see, like we had in Beltzhoover, some of the societal um, things, that support systems that you need, i.e., the work that Chris and his crew are doing, some of the work that myself and others are doing at the 2 Temps Foundation, and we're still smiling. You get those social and those community supports in place. And that's how you can begin to change some of these things that many of our children, because we used to say, and this is true for every community, it takes a village to raise a child.
Mhm.
And if we don't have villages, how can we raise children?
Mhm.
Like Chris said, I couldn't just do what I wanted in the Beltzhoover I grew up in. It wasn't going to happen like that. One of these adults was definitely going to check that behavior. They were going to make me pull my pants up or whatever. And if I said something back, there was going to be a problem. So we have to get back to building communities, which takes families.
I just want to say one last thing. You know, if you think about community, you look at the animal kingdom. You know, when one little sheep or one little doe wanders off by itself, what happens? It gets eaten up by predators. And so when you don't have that community mindset and that community intact, you know, those little sheep just wandering off by themselves get eaten by wolves, and that's what's happening.
Okay, maybe we can take one more question. Luke, can you find another one? And
Yeah, sure. Let's see. How can we as individuals help make an impact? Maybe not in Keith's case specifically, but in juvenile justice as a whole.
mhm.
I would say get.
Go ahead, Rick.
You can go first, bro. I'll go after you.
Well, just quickly, you know, I believe that, you know, we have to reach out to, you know, our politicians, because I believe the biggest problem with the juvenile justice system, the justice system itself, is privatizing prisons and making the criminals a business, turning the justice system into a business. And you know, when you know, locking people up becomes a part of somebody's bottom line, then it's always going to be money over the life of the person. And that's all I'll say to that.
Yeah, I'll say get involved with. We all know youth. You know people. Um, you can Google the 2 Temps Foundation. We'll be looking for help this winter. One of the things that we'll be doing is we'll be working with some juveniles from the juvenile course to get them into our system. Try to build a little link with that. Chris and crew, they working with the adults who coming out of prison. So I will just suggest reaching out, and it doesn't have to be us. I'm saying in your community, in your neighborhood. One of the things I say is, especially you younger people on here, you all have social media. Second word being media. So you are the media. A lot of the people that I work with are quick to say, "Oh, the media doesn't." I'm like, "Well, you have Facebook and you got 1,000 followers, and if this one has 1,000, and blah 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 blah." So how you conduct yourself daily, um, matters, because you are media when you walk out your door. And I say that to say, uh, the young people are watching us. So I have to conduct myself a certain way. So there's Chris, so there's every adult on here, and so do you all as college students, because the kids that are beneath you are looking up to you all. So get involved and get active on your own media.
Yeah. Okay, Rick, could you do me a favor? The 2 Temps Foundation, can you type that into the chat? And
Yeah.
I mean, you work with children through athletics, right?
Yeah, but the foundation is to be off the field. Like, we don't care we use sports as a conduit. So the foundation's aim is to work with the brothers, sisters, cousins, moms, dads. So whether you're an athlete or not, the foundation is, we want to support you because you matter too. Say you are the brother or sister of an athlete, you're his or her support system, and you have needs as well. So yes, I will try to drop it in the chat real quick.
So people can
Sorry,
check.
I wasn't prepared. I didn't have our website, but we do have a website with all of our stuff on there. But I'll put the name in there.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we have to come to an end. I just want to thank the panel, first of all of you for being here. Thank you to the audience for being with us for 90 minutes. That's a long time. And thank you, Dee, for organizing this. And Dee, is there anything else?
No, I think that's it. Thank you all so much for participating in this panel. I think we all learned a lot and we're really grateful.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.